Bonsoir, mes pauvres bêtes. Our story takes place long ago in a humble Louisiana town that thankfully no longer exists. A small Creole community perched on the banks of the Mississippi that French, Spanish, Choctaw, free and enslaved people of color, and various creative melanges of all of the above once called home, which was rather unfortunate, as everyone and everything that came to this town, even if just passing through, was inevitably damned. Long before the Civil War, before America purchased the territory from Napoleon, this sometimes French, sometimes reluctantly Spanish colony, whose original name has been lost to time, came to be known by the rather dramatic moniker Saint Cauchemar, Saint Nightmare. Most nowadays will no longer know of or remember this riverside town, or the poor souls who lived and died there. But I know, and I remember, and I will tell their stories. Today's story, A Grave Misunderstanding. Steamboat explosions were not an uncommon phenomenon when I was alive. Charles Dickens would later muse, American steamboats usually blow up 1 or 2 a week. So on that oppressively humid September day, when the boiler on La Marceline exploded and the Mississippi claimed the extravagant showboat and all of its 138 passengers, crew, and performers with it, it was an awful tragedy, to be sure. But sadly, not a wholly unexpected one. The decimated ship suddenly reappearing back in one piece at the exact same hour of departure the next day, then going under a second time, well, that was certainly far more unexpected. Around the 5th or 6th time the phantom ship appeared and then sank, engulfed in flames, the somber realization dawned on the townsfolk that this macabre spectacle may not come to an end anytime soon. After the weeks stretched into years, as most do when faced with unrelenting horrors they are helpless to resist, the citizens of Saint Cauchemar eventually became immune to the screams and resumed their daily lives. What else could one do, really? The more jaded amongst the townsfolk came to see it as a mere curiosity. Others, a tragedy for the ages that would forever demarcate time into either before or after La Marceline. And before eventually being run out of town for being a public nuisance, that fool Laurence Toussaint saw it as a means to an end. The unscrupulous money grubber began charging sailors, traders, and businessmen from neighboring towns and plantations a whopping 2 pieces of 8 a head to witness his overly theatrical, real-time narration of the daily sinking of La Marceline. Its captain, John Hemmings, not only gave the impressive Western-style vessel its name, as an homage to his beloved youngest daughter, but being a former military man, and therefore a stickler for time and structure, where La Marceline had fallen short in engineering, he ensured it made up for in punctuality. So every day, when the ghost ship's whistle shrieked impatiently to indicate last call for boarding, the showboat's same unwitting cast of doomed Saint Cauchemarian passengers would appear on the dock, hurry aboard deck, and wave an unknowing final goodbye. Then, right at its appointed departure time, to the great pleasure of Captain Hemmings, La Marceline would depart, 1 p.m. on the dot. The first few times it happened, the living who were left behind would scream to warn their loved ones or swim after the boat, but they couldn't hear or see us. We were watching a well-rehearsed echo. All we could do was stand there helplessly as the steamboat drifted upriver. About 6 minutes into the voyage, the festive music from the band would be replaced by the deafening cacophony of the faulty boiler exploding, the shrieks of pain and horror as flesh was devoured by steam and fire, harmonizing with the desperate pleas of the gravely injured, who were unlucky enough to not have been killed instantly and left to drown in the Mississippi, until about 13 past 1, when silence would consume Saint Cauchemar once more. Soon, a little before the dreaded hour of 1 o'clock, most villagers began adopting the practice of closing their shutters, singing loudly, playing music, banging pots and pans, picking a fight, or making love with their spouse. Anything to drown out the noise of suffering. Having only been invented a few years earlier, most early steamboats were small and mainly transported cargo, or the very rich, from New Orleans, bypassing their small town in favor of larger port cities like Baton Rouge or Natchez. So when they caught wind a passenger vessel would be making a stop in Saint Cauchemar, a flashy showboat with live entertainment no less, many locals clamored to nab a coveted spot on board and bragging rights. This meant nearly everyone in town was touched by the tragedy, having lost either a friend, relative, or their favorite heavy-handed barkeep in the incident. Over the years, the daily crowds holding vigil at the dock dwindled as, one by one, they resigned themselves to the new, unsteady rhythm of life after loss. With one notable exception. Delphine Dubois, a well-to-do quadroon socialite and gens de couleur libre, or libre as we free people of color were called during the Spanish years, stood by the river every day to wave goodbye to the love of her life, Auguste Saint-Georges, as if maybe, somehow, this time would be different. Like a living ghost, the tall woman, gaunt with grief, haunted the dock in her airy muslin gown and parasol. Ever fashionable, even in mourning, she wore the wide-brimmed bergère hat she had imported from France, sloped at an angle, giving her both privacy and a bit of drama. In its shade, one could only catch furtive glimpses of her skillfully rouged lips and warm cherry-wood skin. Her frenetic curls swept up and hidden away from the world by the mandatory silk tignon she wrapped around her hair, as all free women must, though she'd always free a few rogue honey-colored tendrils from the loathsome headscarf to frame her face and nape of her neck as a small personal rebellion against the colony's ridiculous law. She would clutch Auguste's monogrammed handkerchief to her lightly freckled cheeks and inhale what was left of his diminishing scent, trying to conjure her love once more. His passion for debating politics, his questionable taste in art, his generosity, the way his auburn curls fell into his eyes like an impish little boy when he told a racy joke, and how he always knew exactly what to say to soothe her heart in times of trouble. What would you say now, Auguste? With the same predictability of the steamboat keeping to schedule, she would rewatch the ghastly scenes stoically, release a rogue wail of grief here or there, eventually compose herself, then return home to the lavish townhouse Auguste had built for her, that now felt so empty, without the warmth of his husky, rambunctious laugh bounding down the halls. Empty, except of course, for Delphine Dubois herself, and her faithful African housekeeper Zola, who had been with her family for generations. Although the fact that the weathered Wolof woman was owned by the Dubois family might have had more to do with the servant's longevity in the household than pure loyalty alone, but I digress. Upon returning home, the Mistress Dubois would sit in somber silence, as Zola first served her an afternoon snack of beignets or other decadent sweets with a cup of souchong tea, and then proceed to sort through the day's post searching for the letter. Don't forget this letter, as it's quite important, but we'll get back to that in a moment. Now, Zola had been by Delphine's side through every scraped knee, bee sting, or torn stocking since the young Dubois was a little girl, and she felt akin to a second mother to her mischievous young charge. The housekeeper's own mother, on top of having been an overly pragmatic and stoic matriarch, had been a celebrated seamstress back in Senegal. So through the years, Zola had become extremely well-versed in mending any and all manner of rips and tears young Delphine brought to her after her outdoor adventures. But when it came to mending the tatters of a grief-stricken soul, her skills utterly failed her. She compensated for her inherited inability to comfort with words or affection by soothing her mistress's depression with pastries and protecting her from that letter at all costs. As the tired, leathery old woman shuffled through the various correspondences in the post, she quickly found the envelope with the hastily penned "To Mademoiselle Delphine Dubois" on its face and tossed it into the fire without a word. Because by this point, they both knew what the letter was, and they did not need to speak on it. Not that either of the women had ever opened it to read its contents, but everyone in town would recognize that purple wax seal as belonging singularly to one Madame Auguste Saint-Georges. Delphine started receiving the letters in the post the day after the accident, and without fail, a new one arrived in the mail every day. Of course, curiosity gnawed at her. How could it not? But she managed to keep it at bay, because receiving an angrily scrawled letter on the daily from one's lover's jealous wife is an unpleasant enough affair. Receiving an angrily scrawled letter from one's lover's jealous wife nearly a decade after she died horribly in a steamboat explosion is an entirely new level of unpleasantness. Delphine and Zola would remain faithful partners in their now well-rehearsed dance of willful ignorance for years. That is, until the unfortunate day her loyal servant fell gravely ill. Whether it was just the ravages of time, finally catching up to the elderly woman, or the machinations of fate, having a deliberate hand in her illness, the importance Zola's absence in the house that day played in the events that followed cannot be overstated. You see, poor Charlotte, the wafy French girl who was hired temporarily to fill in for the ailing housemaid, was all of 12, inexperienced, and, while not dumb, tended to filter out information as it suited her. So while Zola had informed her young replacement on multiple occasions from her sickbed that the letter with the unique seal should be left unopened and promptly burned upon receipt, after about a week of obeying the command, Charlotte's curiosity got the better of her. And if there's one thing the townsfolk, and even her own mother, would tell you about the wide-eyed wisp of a brunette, was that her impulsivity was matched only by her uncanny and complete inability to follow instructions. So that day, after returning from the dock, Delphine closed the door behind her, and her tear-streaked jade eyes were greeted by those of a guilty young Charlotte standing in the foyer. Delphine paused and placed her things down on the small table by the door before turning back to her new hire with an apprehensive inhale. She must have news about Zola. First my Auguste and now my Zola. My heart can't take it. But the words that came out of Charlotte's mouth were not what she expected. They were far worse. "Pardon, mademoiselle," she squeaked, "but it just seemed important. Otherwise, why would she keep sending it?" As Delphine's hesitant gaze crept down to the help's hands, her cheeks drained of all color once she saw what the trembling girl was clutching. The letter, now opened. Its siren song calling, pulling her under where the melody only she could hear. A melody so very... She quickly snapped herself back to the foyer. "Foolish girl, what have you done?" It was both a reprimand and a genuine question. She couldn't deny she had long ruminated on what the daily envelope from Auguste's wife contained. Was it the exact same letter every day? Or a new correspondence, penned each morning, fresh from the beyond? Most likely a missive, eviscerating her for stealing her husband's affections. Or maybe, she prayed, a letter absolving Delphine of the crime of falling desperately and hopelessly in love with a man that she, too, had fallen desperately and hopelessly in love with. She hadn't meant to hurt the woman by carrying on with Auguste, even after he'd reluctantly married the shy, mousy Spanish steel heiress at his father's behest. And it's not like being a mistress was a unique title in those days anyway, though it's one she despised more than anything. It was rather common at the time for Frenchmen or Spaniards to be romantically involved with free, and not so free, women of color, bestowing upon them lavish gifts, affection, and often children who could legitimately carry on the family name. But under the French Code Noir, though the man could eschew public opinion and choose to live with her in sin, his colored lover, or mother of his children, could never legally be his wife. This held true no matter how intensely he loved her, or even continued to love her, long after the man inevitably settled down to marry a respected local white woman, either out of societal or financial pressure, or sometimes, though the bereft women left behind hated to accept it, for love. Delphine's family ran a successful sawmill, so she was well off herself, and respected by everyone in her community, except for maybe the grocer, but he knew what he did, and she didn't feel at all bad about what she had said to him in the square. She was a devout Catholic, and had never set out to be with a married man. If she could have legally wed Auguste, her wealth could have easily soothed his family's financial woes, and the Spanish steel heiress's heart needn't ever be involved, let alone broken. Delphine always justified it to herself with the thought, he was rightfully mine first. She had only run into Madame Saint-Georges on a few occasions in passing, and found her to be an inoffensive, though rather unremarkable woman, with stick-straight hair that couldn't decide if it was brown or blonde, plastered to her scalp in an overly tight bun, since there wasn't much else you could do with it. Whereas Auguste would spend hours melting into Delphine's wild mane of disobedient caramel curls as they stayed up all night by the fire, discussing everything from local politics to alternative interpretations of Voltaire. Plain, quiet, with nothing much to say in the way of literature or current events. The only thing that had struck Delphine about her lover's wife was her piercing hazel eyes. The first time she really noticed them was when the opera had come to New Orleans. Delphine had just pulled up to their home in the covered carriage to gather Auguste for the journey to the city. Delphine had slunk back in the seat to avoid Madame Saint-Georges' attention, but when she glanced out to see what was taking her love so long to join her, as there were few things she hated more than being late for the opera, the two women's eyes met for a brief moment. The flash of defeat she saw in Madame's hazel gaze pierced her, and since that day, had never let her go. Although Auguste had told his wife he had some urgent work matter to attend to and would be back with all haste, Delphine saw by how the woman's sad eyes tracked her husband as he perfunctorily kissed her goodbye, sauntered down the steps, and jumped into the carriage with his hiding mistress, that she knew exactly what and who he'd be attending to, and how she had clearly still loved him anyway. From that day, while not apologetic for loving or being with Auguste, Delphine felt somewhat sorry for her, and a festering guilt for contributing to the ache she saw in those eyes. Now that Madame Saint-Georges was dead, there was no making it right. It was a sin she could never be absolved of. But maybe this letter was just that. The absolution she'd been craving all these years. Maybe. She could bear the suspense no longer. She snatched the opened letter from the baffled girl, nearly bowling her over, then flew up the staircase and enclosed herself in her bedchambers to finally unravel this long-held mystery. Delphine steadied herself at the edge of her bed and clasped the letter tightly. She ran her shaky, lace-gloved fingers along the heavy textured paper for a few moments before taking a measured breath and finally unfurling it. The contents of the letter were these. Current events have brought to my attention that there has been a rather grave misunderstanding, a misunderstanding that demands to be remedied. Allow me to return this to your possession, as I believe it was first rightfully yours. Regards, Madame Helena Saint-Georges. And with that, something fluttered down from the folds of the letter into her lap. The steamboat ticket Auguste had purchased for Delphine so that the two of them could run away down the Mississippi together in style. A ticket his wife must have seen, presuming it was a surprise cruise for her, and Auguste, the ever-competent pretender, had obliged her, leaving Delphine behind at the dock that day. The ticket, though waterlogged and scorched around the edges, had something still printed on it, clear as day. Crescent City River Company, La Marceline, departure time 1 p.m. from the port of St. Cauchemar. A warm breeze and a joyous upbeat tune suddenly flooded her senses as an unseen band started to play. Percussion and raucous fingers dancing across piano keys reverberated off every surface of the room. The rhythm began to sweep her up in its thrall when she heard something else. A deafening explosion. She sprang up as if the ticket had just bit her, and the hateful thing landed in the sudden pool of wetness that was rapidly rising around her ankles. Billowing clouds of smoke, fire, and the raging waters of the Mississippi poured in from the walls, as if the seams of the room had burst. Stunned, her ears still ringing from the explosion, she tried to choke out a scream that devolved into a coughing fit from the fumes, the heat quickly scorching anything in its path. Paintings, expensive tapestries, and linens, as the deep olive paint blistered and curled off the wall. She frantically waded through the now waist-high water that drenched her petticoats, which lifted impertinently off the ground, floating around her, joining her upholstered chaise, footstool, and various personal trinkets that were also bobbing around the room. The door. If she could just make it to the door, then maybe. She outstretched a desperate arm and clasped the ornately engraved brass doorknob. That bottled scream from earlier finally escaped her throat. The doorknob was red hot, scalding her hand, singeing her lace gloves, and the searing shock made her lose her footing, plunging her backwards into the murky darkness of the water. As she tried and failed to right herself, she saw the outline of a woman standing there, staring back down at her through the water, which grew thick and heavy, like a rippling, translucent tar. Delphine thrashed about under the crushing weight of the Mississippi, reached out her hand for help, thinking it her young maidservant. But the figure didn't move a muscle. It simply stared, with eyes that seemed to slightly pity her, but not enough to save her from her fate. As the seconds turned into many seconds, a slight smile crossed the woman's face, and her once sad, aching eyes now seemed unapologetically satisfied to watch the thrashing finally come to an end. Those hazel eyes were the last thing Delphine saw as the water slowly dragged her under. Of course, in the weeks following the mysterious domestic drowning of Mademoiselle Delphine Dubois, there were many questions, none of which the shaken young maidservant could rightfully answer, regarding how Mademoiselle Delphine had drowned in an, up until then, famously dry second-story room. The hapless Charlotte was initially charged with murder, but the case against her was a weak one, with next to no evidence to prove how the young maidservant could have both drowned and burned her mistress alive in her room, not to mention no motivation for doing so. She had been well paid for the week she had been there, and while not excessively friendly, there was no bad blood reported between the two. The furniture, linens, and of course Mademoiselle herself, had all been simultaneously scorched and soaked through, but there was no visible or even standing water for her to have drowned in, and the carpet was bone dry. Not a lick of smoke nor flame had touched anything beyond that room. It's as though the fire simply put itself out. Eventually, Charlotte was acquitted, and Mademoiselle Dubois' death would be chalked up as an accident. Everyone knew that likely wasn't the case, but no one had any real way of knowing or proving how the young woman lost her life. And since that wasn't the first bazaar happening in their town, and was unfortunately far from being the last, people simply wanted to get on with their lives, bracing themselves for the next inevitable horror that was to come. Of the many strange happenings related to this case, one of them occurred at exactly 1 p.m. on the day after Delphine Dubois' death. The villagers saw La Marceline set off yet again on its short-lived daily voyage with Captain Hemmings at the helm. Only on this day, after the explosion at 1:06, it finally disappeared below the waters one last time, never again to torment the people of Saint Cauchemar. Why would it? The exchange had been made. All the passengers who were meant to depart with La Marceline that fateful day were now accounted for. The townsfolk would never know how the young maidservant opening some letter brought about the mysterious drowning of Delphine Dubois, and ultimately, the end of the horrifying daily sinking of the steamboat. But Charlotte knew. It was a heavy truth the young maidservant would carry the rest of her days. If there's any good to be gained from the horrors that transpired here, at the very least, in all her future employments, young Charlotte always made quite sure to follow instructions. But this is not the story of the flighty young maidservant. That's a tale for another day. No. This story belongs solely to the late Monsieur and Madame Saint-Georges, the now late Mademoiselle Delphine Dubois, and the ever-on-time La Marceline.